At just past midnight on August the 12th, air raid sirens tore through the port city of Novorossiysk on Russia's Black Sea coast, and for the next several hours, the sky over the naval base lit up with tracer fire, drone engines, and explosions that residents said shook windows more than 300 kilometers from the nearest front line. By sunrise, Ukraine's general staff had confirmed what Russian officials could not hide. 4 warships of Russia's Black Sea fleet had been hit in one of the most significant single strikes on Russian naval power since the war began. This is a story about a navy that has spent 3 years running out of places to hide, and about a country that may no longer have the industrial capacity to replace what keeps getting taken from it. Let's start with what we actually know, because in a war this heavily contested, that matters more than ever. According to Ukraine's general staff, in a joint operation carried out by Ukraine's defense forces on the night of August 11th into August 12th, units struck the naval base at Novorossiysk in Russia's Krasnodar Krai. Preliminary information released by the general staff, and separately confirmed in part by Ukraine's security service, the SBU, named 4 vessels that sustained damage of varying degrees. 2 of them were Project 135E6 frigates, the Admiral Makarov and the Admiral Essen. The third was a Project 21631 Buyan-M small missile ship. The fourth was a Project 22160 patrol vessel, the Vasily Bykov. The SBU added that the strike also hit a 30 N6E radar system, a critical component of an S-300 air defense battery, along with a mobile firing position on one of the base's piers and infrastructure spanning several other piers nearby. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the operation personally, saying it combined domestically produced Palianytsia jet-powered strike drones, Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, and naval drones, all aimed at naval positions, air defense assets, and port facilities at once. He called it a unique operation against what he described as Russia's last major naval stronghold on the Black Sea. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment, because 3 years ago, nobody would have used it to describe Novorossiysk. Sevastopol was supposed to be that stronghold. Novorossiysk was the fallback. To understand why this strike matters, you have to go back to where Russia's Black Sea fleet actually started this war, and how much ground, or rather how much water, it has already lost. Before 2022, the Black Sea Fleet's home was Sevastopol, on the Crimean Peninsula, a deep-water ice-free port that has served as Russia's principal naval base in the region since long before the current war. According to the Center for International Maritime Security, Sevastopol historically hosted around 80% of the fleet's total tonnage, a concentration of naval power that made it not just a base, but the fleet's beating heart. That changed fast. In April of 2022, Ukrainian anti-ship missiles sank the Moskva, the fleet's flagship cruiser, in what remains one of the most symbolically devastating losses of the entire war for Russia's navy. It was, according to defense analysts cited by Naval News, the largest surface combatant lost by any navy in decades of conflict anywhere in the world. The losses didn't stop there. In September of 2023, Ukrainian cruise missiles struck a dry dock in Sevastopol, destroying a landing ship and an attack submarine in a single attack, according to reporting by Newsweek. That same month, a strike hit the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters building itself. Alexei Melnik, a Ukrainian defense analyst quoted at the time, noted that these strikes exposed a fleet with limited options and aging equipment. Most of it inherited from a shipbuilding tradition the war had already crippled. Mikhailo Zagorodnyk, a defense expert referenced in that same Newsweek report, put it plainly. Replacing destroyed or badly damaged vessels was going to take years, not months, because Russia's shipbuilding sector was already limited by economic strain, international sanctions, and a shadow of its own Soviet-era capacity, one that had relied heavily on Ukrainian shipyards before the war began. Facing that pressure, Russia did what militaries do when a position becomes untenable. It retreated. Naval assets began shifting east, more than 200 miles away, to the port of Novorossiysk in Krasnodar Krai, and to a lesser extent to Feodosia in occupied Crimea. Analysts writing for The Conversation described the move as a major symbolic and operational victory for Ukraine, noting that Sevastopol's dry docks were no longer fully functional, and that Novorossiysk lacked the same repair capability, especially for submarines. The head of Ukraine's SBU, Vasily Bykov, said in comments reported last year that Ukraine had effectively confined the Russian fleet to Novorossiysk Bay. British defense intelligence, cited in multiple outlets, called Novorossiysk a crucial port for sheltering the fleet's most valuable remaining assets. In other words, Novorossiysk wasn't just another base. It became the last safe harbor Russia had left in the Black Sea, at least on paper. The problem is, it never stayed safe for long. In November of 2025, Ukrainian forces struck a major oil terminal at Novorossiysk overnight, triggering a fire and damaging valuable infrastructure, according to Ukraine's general staff. That same strike reportedly damaged a launcher belonging to Russia's S-400 air defense system. Krasnodar Governor Veniamin Kondratiev confirmed the attack, saying falling drone debris injured at least 4 people and damaged several apartment buildings, prompting a state of emergency in the region. Then in March of this year, on the night of March 2nd, Ukrainian drones struck the port again, this time causing what one open-source defense newsletter described as significant damage to multiple vessels and igniting a fire that burned through munitions and fuel stores overnight. Notably, the Admiral Essen was reportedly hit in that attack on March 2nd, and the Admiral Makarov 4 days later, on March 6th, according to the Security Service of Ukraine's own accounting of past strikes on those same 2 ships. Which means that when Ukraine says it hit those same 2 frigates again on August 12th, it isn't describing a new target. It's describing a ship that has now been targeted and apparently damaged at least twice in 5 months. That repetition matters because it goes to the heart of the question in this story's title: can Russia actually replace what keeps getting hit? Before we get into the details of this specific strike, it helps to understand the scale of what Russia is actually working with here, because a single number, 4 ships, only means something in context. According to a detailed assessment from the Center for International Maritime Security, the Black Sea Fleet as a formal structure has historically counted around 45 warships and 7 submarines, split principally between Sevastopol and Novorossiysk, representing roughly 21% of the entire Russian Navy's surface combatants and about 10% of its total submarine force. The force was built up significantly after Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, which freed Moscow from the terms of the earlier Kharkov Agreement, a 2010 deal between then-Presidents Dmitry Medvedev and Viktor Yanukovych that had actually restricted how much Russia could expand or modernize its Black Sea assets while operating out of leased Ukrainian territory. Once that restriction disappeared, Russia poured resources into rebuilding the fleet, including bringing new frigates like the Admiral Grigorovich, Admiral Essen, and Admiral Makarov into service specifically for Black Sea operations, according to older reporting on Russian naval crew formations from that period. That investment is precisely why losses in this specific class of ship sting so much more than losses elsewhere in the Russian Navy. These frigates weren't leftover Soviet hardware nearing retirement. They were part of a genuinely modern investment Russia made after 2014, intended to project power across the Black Sea for decades. Watching that same small batch of ships get targeted repeatedly and apparently damaged repeatedly tells you something about how thin the remaining margin actually is. It's also worth understanding the weapons Ukraine used to reach all the way into Novorossiysk, because the fact that Kyiv can strike a port more than 300 kilometers from the nearest front line without a conventional navy of its own is itself part of this story. The Palianytsia is a Ukrainian-developed jet-powered strike drone, essentially a low-cost cruise missile alternative, first unveiled publicly in 2024 as part of Ukraine's push to build a domestic long-range strike capability that doesn't depend entirely on Western-supplied missiles with their political and logistical restrictions. The Neptune is a Ukrainian-designed anti-ship cruise missile, originally built for coastal defense, the same missile system credited with sinking the Moskva back in April of 2022. Pairing the Neptune, a weapon purpose-built to sink ships, with jet-powered drones capable of overwhelming air defenses through sheer numbers, and naval surface drones capable of approaching a harbor at sea level under radar coverage, represents a layered strike package designed specifically to defeat exactly the kind of defenses a naval base like Novorossiysk would have in place. According to the Ukrainian outlet Mezha, the operation was explicitly described by the General Staff as a joint effort combining multiple branches of Ukraine's defense forces working together rather than a single weapon system acting alone. Let's look at exactly what was hit this time, because the details matter more than the headline number of 4. The Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov are both Project 11356 frigates, sometimes called Grigorovich-class ships, after the lead vessel in the series. According to the Ukrainska Pravda outlet, citing Ukraine's security service, both ships are confirmed Kaliber cruise missile carriers, each fitted with 8 vertical launch cells capable of firing Kaliber, Onyx, or in some configurations, Zircon missiles, the same weapons Russia has routinely used to strike targets deep inside Ukraine. The Maritime Executive, an industry publication covering naval affairs, reported that satellite imagery reviewed by open-source analyst George Barros showed extensive damage across the Novorossiysk base following the strike, with multiple vessels affected, though the outlet was careful to note that as of the day after the attack, none of the targeted ships appeared to be visibly on fire or sinking, based on available satellite photography. That's an important distinction. Damage does not necessarily mean destruction, and Ukraine's own general staff acknowledged that the full extent of the harm to each vessel was still being assessed in the hours and days following the strike. Still, even damage carries a cost that isn't easily undone. According to reporting from the defense industry outlet Excelenova Plus, cited by Defense Blog, satellite analysis suggested the Admiral Makarov sustained damage near its Kaliber missile launch cells and around its rear superstructure, the section of the ship where key radar systems are typically mounted. The Admiral Essen reportedly showed damage in a similar area near its own launchers. If accurate, and this detail remains unconfirmed by Russian authorities, that kind of damage doesn't just take a ship out of action for a few weeks of cosmetic repair. It can affect the very system that makes these ships valuable in the first place, their ability to fire long-range cruise missiles at all. Beyond the two frigates, the Buyan-M missile ship and the Vasily Bykov patrol vessel rounded out the 4 confirmed hits. Some outlets, including EU Today, reported additional unconfirmed claims based on satellite imagery, suggesting possible damage to a Project 266 and minesweeper, a research vessel called the Viktor Kirokov, and a reconnaissance ship named the Priazovia, along with impacts near shore facilities tied to Russia's 4th Submarine Brigade. It's important to be honest here. Those additional claims have not been confirmed by either Russia's government or Ukraine's own general staff, and the extent of any damage to those particular vessels cannot be established from satellite images alone. This is exactly the kind of claim where sourcing discipline matters, because in a war fought as much through information as through missiles, it's easy for unconfirmed details to calcify into accepted fact. They haven't been confirmed, so they're presented here as claims, not established outcomes. What we do know, with more certainty, is the human and economic toll on the ground in Novorossiysk itself. Krasnodar region governor Veniamin Kondratiev said the wave of Ukrainian strikes killed at least 3 people, including an 8-year-old child, and injured more than 10 others, according to reporting picked up by the Moscow Times. Dozens of homes were reportedly damaged. Local authorities declared a state of emergency in the city. 2 of the port's 3 major grain terminals were forced to halt operations. According to figures cited in that same coverage, the NKHP terminal alone normally handles around 12% of Russia's total grain exports. A reminder that Novorossiysk isn't purely a military target. It's also one of the most important commercial ports in the entire country. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter, and a significant share of that grain physically passes through facilities at Novorossiysk before it ever reaches a ship bound for international markets. The Royal United Services Institute, a UK-based defense think tank, has also noted that Novorossiysk plays an outsized role in Russia's oil exports, with roughly 22% of the country's oil shipments moving through Black Sea loading points, including this port. So, when Ukraine strikes here, it isn't only degrading naval capability, it's applying pressure to 2 of the revenue streams that help fund the war in the first place, energy exports and agricultural exports, in a single operation. This isn't the first time Novorossiysk's economic infrastructure has taken damage either, and understanding that history helps explain why this port has become such a recurring target rather than a one-off. Beyond the November 2025 strike on the oil terminal already mentioned, industry reporting this month referenced Russian energy company Gazprom confirming that its military intercepted 26 Ukrainian drones targeting energy sites in the wider Krasnodar region within a single week, an indication of just how sustained this pressure campaign against Russian infrastructure in the area has become. Several pro-war Russian commentators and Telegram channels discussing damage from strikes around the same period pointed to facilities, including a major fertilizer producer in the region, Eurochem's Belorechensky plant, as having also come under attack, though that specific claim falls outside what Ukraine's official channels have themselves confirmed and should be treated with appropriate caution. What's better documented is the pattern of Ukraine deliberately pairing military targets with economic ones in this particular region, striking naval infrastructure and export terminals within the same operations, rather than treating them as separate campaigns. It's also worth noting the context of the wider night of strikes on August 12th, because Novorossiysk wasn't the only front active that night. Open-source reporting aggregating Russian Ministry of Defense claims indicated that Russian air defense units reported intercepting several hundred Ukrainian drones across multiple regions of the country that same night, with the heaviest concentration around the Black Sea zone specifically. Meanwhile, Russia was simultaneously conducting its own large-scale strikes against Ukrainian territory, hitting port and industrial infrastructure in Odessa and targeting the Zaporizhzhstal steel plant in Zaporizhzhia, using Iskander-M ballistic missiles, anti-radiation weapons, cruise missiles, and well over 100 strike drones in a single night, according to that same tracking. That's worth sitting with for a second. Even as Ukraine was executing one of its most damaging naval strikes of the year, Russia was carrying out one of its own large-scale bombardments of Ukrainian cities in return. Neither side has paused this exchange to absorb the other's blow. If anything, both sides appear to be escalating the pace of strikes against each other's infrastructure as this stage of the war continues. Now, to the central question this story is built around, even if we take the more conservative, confirmed version of events, 4 warships damaged, some seriously, none confirmed destroyed, can Russia actually replace what it just lost the use of? The honest answer, based on the available evidence, leans heavily toward no, not quickly and not easily. Here's why. Russia's naval shipbuilding industry has never fully recovered from the loss of Ukrainian shipyards after 2014, and certainly not since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. Analysts cited by Newsweek described Russia's surviving Black Sea vessels bluntly, noting that most of the fleet's remaining ships are old, with significant issues in weapon systems and equipment more broadly. The Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov themselves aren't new ships. They entered service around a decade ago, part of a small batch of Project 11356 frigates, whose construction was already delayed by the loss of Ukrainian-supplied gas turbine engines after 2014, forcing Russia to source replacement engines domestically or from other partners, a process that took years even before the current war added sanctions, isolation, and battlefield attrition into the mix. According to Naval News, the Admiral Essen is one of only 2 Russian frigates remaining in the entire Black Sea, a fleet that, since the sinking of the Moskva in April of 2022, has had no cruiser-class flagship at all. That scarcity is the whole point. These aren't replaceable line items. They are, according to that same analysis, effectively the largest and most capable strategic surface assets Russia has left in that theater. When a fleet is down to a handful of frigates covering an entire sea, and 2 of those frigates get hit for a second time in 5 months, there isn't a deep bench of replacements waiting in a shipyard somewhere ready to take their place. It's also worth putting this single strike inside the wider pattern of what's been happening to Russia's military capacity more broadly this year. According to reporting from Euromaidan Press, citing an assessment from Ukrainian military intelligence and remarks by President Zelensky on August the 11th, Russia is reportedly preparing a new mass mobilization drive following its parliamentary elections this fall, with plans to call up several 100,000 additional personnel by the end of 2026, and roughly the same number again by the end of 2027. That same reporting noted that Russian battlefield losses have been overtaking the pace of voluntary contract recruitment, a trend that, if accurate, would help explain why Moscow might feel forced back toward conscription on a larger scale, despite the political costs that come with it. Separately, United 24 Media, citing statistics attributed to Russia's own defense ministry, reported that Russian forces lost just under 130,000 troops killed and wounded during the first 4 months of 2026 alone, with March and April described as record months for losses. According to that analysis, Ukraine destroyed or disabled more than 90,000 Russian troops in the first quarter of the year, while Russian recruitment over the same period was estimated at only 70 to 80,000, leaving what analysts described as a persistent monthly shortfall of roughly 10 to 15% between losses and replacements. None of those troop figures come from Ukraine's general staff directly confirming Russian internal recruitment data, and it's worth being upfront that estimates like these, especially ones involving enemy casualty figures, are inherently difficult to verify from outside and should be treated as informed estimates rather than confirmed fact. But taken together with what's happening at sea, a pattern starts to emerge. On land, Russia appears to be losing personnel faster than it can recruit them without resorting to unpopular mass conscription. At sea, it appears to be losing warships and having them damaged faster than a sanctioned, shrunken shipbuilding industry can plausibly replace them. Those 2 pressures don't operate in isolation. A military short on trained sailors and short on hulls to put them on faces, compounding, not additive, strain. There's a broader strategic thread here too, one that goes beyond any single strike. Ukraine has managed to apply this kind of pressure on Russia's navy despite not fielding a traditional navy of its own in any conventional sense. Euromaidan Press summarized it directly, noting that Ukraine drove the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol without a navy of its own, relying instead on missiles, sea drones, and long-range strike drones, forcing Russia's remaining ships back to Novorossiysk, farther from the front line, but, as this latest strike demonstrates, still very much within reach. That same reporting made a stark observation, that Russia now holds no waters in the Black Sea it can consider fully its own, and no harbor left where its ships can be considered truly safe. It's a remarkable reversal when you consider where this war started. In the opening days of the full-scale invasion in 2022, Russia's Black Sea Fleet was expected to be an overwhelming advantage, capable of blockading Ukrainian ports, launching missiles from international waters with near impunity, and eventually supporting an amphibious assault on Odessa that never came. Instead, 3.5 years later, that same fleet has been pushed more than 200 miles east, has lost its flagship, has lost its primary home port, and according to this latest strike, is now taking damage even in the port it retreated to as a last resort. That reversal is worth sitting with a bit longer because it wasn't the outcome most Western military analysts expected in the early weeks of this war. Ukraine had no meaningful surface navy of its own when the full-scale invasion began, and Russia's fleet, still comfortably based in Sevastopol at the time, was widely expected to enforce a blockade on Ukrainian grain exports, potentially support an amphibious landing near Odessa, and provide largely unchallenged missile strike capability from international waters. Almost none of that played out the way early assessments predicted. The blockade attempt instead helped trigger a grain corridor crisis that drew in Turkish and United Nations mediation. The amphibious assault on Odessa never materialized. And the fleet that was supposed to operate with near impunity has instead spent the past 3.5 years being pushed steadily backward, absorbing losses it has struggled to replace, hit repeatedly by weapons built by a country that, on paper, wasn't supposed to have the naval capability to reach it at all. So where does that leave things going forward? Ukraine's general staff said in its initial statement that information about the scale of the damage from the August 12th strike was still being clarified, a fairly standard acknowledgement in the immediate aftermath of any major strike, but one worth repeating here rather than skipping past. As of the most recent reporting available, Russian officials had not issued a detailed public accounting of the damage to the 4 named vessels, nor a public statement disputing Ukraine's claims about which ships were hit. That silence itself is not confirmation of anything specific, but it is notable, especially compared to past incidents where Russian officials, including Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, after a June 2025 drone strike on Russian airfields, did eventually respond publicly to acknowledge damage while downplaying its severity, insisting equipment described as destroyed by Western assessments had merely been damaged and would be restored. Let's be precise about what's confirmed, what's claimed, and what remains contested here, because that distinction is the whole foundation of honest reporting on a war where both sides have strong incentives to shape the narrative. Confirmed by Ukraine's own general staff and separately corroborated in part by the SBU. 4 Russian warships, the Admiral Makarov, the Admiral Essen, the Buyan-M missile ship, and the Vasily Bykov patrol vessel, sustained damage of varying degrees during a strike on the Novorossiysk naval base overnight on August 11th into August 12th, 2026, using a combination of Palianytsia drones, Neptune missiles, and naval drones. Also confirmed via Regional Governor Veniamin Kondratyev. At least 3 civilian deaths, including a child, and over 10 injuries, along with the shutdown of 2 grain terminals at the port. Claimed, but not independently confirmed by either government, additional damage to a minesweeper, a research vessel, and a reconnaissance ship, based solely on satellite imagery analysis from open-source accounts. And still unknown, as of this recording, the full operational status of the Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov going forward, whether their caliber launch systems remain functional, and how long repairs, if the ships can be repaired at Novorossiysk at all given the port's limited maintenance infrastructure compared to Sevastopol's now degraded dry docks, might actually take. There's one more piece of context that matters here, because this strike on Novorossiysk did not happen in a vacuum. It happened during a period when both sides appeared to be positioning for an escalation in the weeks ahead. According to the Institute for the Study of War's Critical Threats Project, in an assessment published just days before the Novorossiysk strike, Ukraine's Strategic Communications Center reported, citing United States intelligence, that Russia was preparing to conduct a major strike campaign against energy infrastructure in Kyiv City ahead of Ukraine's Independence Day on August 24th, potentially drawing on a strategic reserve of ballistic missiles to maximize damage. That same assessment noted that Russia has historically opened seasonal strike campaigns against Ukraine's energy grid in early autumn, and that this year Moscow may look to move that timeline earlier, in part to take advantage of what Ukrainian President Zelensky described on August 5th as a significant shortfall in the number of air defense interceptors Ukraine has been receiving compared to what it needs. If that assessment holds up, the Novorossiysk strike may represent Ukraine trying to degrade Russian capacity, particularly around cruise missile-carrying warships, before an anticipated wave of Russian strikes against its own capital's power grid. It's also worth remembering that Russia's war effort in the Black Sea doesn't exist separately from its war effort on land, and that a navy struggling to protect its remaining ships is operating alongside ground forces facing their own well-documented strain. Reporting from Euromaidan Press on the war's overall trajectory noted that Ukraine claimed to have destroyed or disabled nearly 14,000 Russian vehicles in July alone, and separately, the same outlet's coverage of the ongoing conflict has tracked the continued presence of North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces, with an estimated 11,000 North Korean soldiers stationed across 4 brigades in Russia's own Kursk and Belgorod regions, and an additional 6,000 personnel reportedly expected for infrastructure and support roles. The United States has publicly called for an end to those deployments, according to that same reporting, arguing they violate multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions Russia itself has previously been bound by. None of this directly explains what happened at Novorossiysk, but it paints a picture of a military stretched across multiple fronts, leaning on foreign troops to hold ground in the west of Russia itself, while simultaneously trying, and on this occasion failing, to protect a naval base its own fleet retreated to for safety. Taken all together, the picture that emerges is not one of a single catastrophic loss, because by the most careful, sourced reading of the available evidence, that isn't what happened here. 4 ships were damaged, not confirmed, destroyed. 3 civilians were killed. 2 grain terminals went offline. What makes this story significant isn't the scale of any single night's damage. It's the trend line running underneath it, a pattern of repeated strikes against an ever-shrinking set of high-value targets absorbed by a shipbuilding and mobilization base that multiple independent analysts, cited across Newsweek, Naval News, and defense-focused outlets tracking the war, describe as structurally unable to replace what it loses at anywhere close to the rate. It's losing it. The sourcing behind this account draws on statements from Ukraine's General Staff of the Armed Forces, Ukraine's Security Service, and public remarks from President Volodymyr Zelensky, alongside independent reporting from Ukrinform, Ukrainska Pravda, the Maritime Executive, Euromaidan Press, the Moscow Times, and EU Today, as well as historical context on the Black Sea Fleet's earlier losses from Newsweek, Naval News, the Center for International Maritime Security, and The Conversation. Where Russian officials or state sources are referenced, that's noted explicitly, and where a specific claim comes only from open-source satellite analysis rather than an official government statement, that distinction has been flagged rather than blurred. One more angle worth addressing directly is why Russia hasn't simply moved its remaining fleet somewhere further out of range altogether, because on the surface, that might seem like the obvious next step after Novorossiysk. The honest answer is that the options are narrower than they sound. Reporting has referenced discussion of a potential future Russian naval facility at Akamchire in Abkhazia, a breakaway region of Georgia that Russia has backed militarily since the 2008 war, as a possible longer-term relocation site further from Ukrainian strike range. But building a functional naval base capable of supporting frigates, missile ships, and submarines from essentially nothing is not a project that happens in months. It requires new piers, new maintenance and repair facilities, new air defense coverage, and a logistics chain to supply and crew it, all in a location with none of Novorossiysk's or Sevastopol's existing infrastructure. Until and unless that kind of facility becomes operational, Russia's Black Sea Fleet remains tied to the 2 ports it already has, one of which, Sevastopol, has degraded repair capacity following years of strikes, and the other of which, Novorossiysk, just demonstrated on August 12th that it isn't the sanctuary it was treated as for the past 2 years. What's clear, even accounting for everything that remains unverified, is that this is not an isolated incident. It's the latest entry in a pattern stretching back more than 3 years, one where a Russian navy that entered this war with numerical and technological superiority in the Black Sea has been steadily pushed backward, port by port, ship by ship, into a smaller and smaller operational space. Novorossiysk was supposed to be the answer to that problem. On the morning of August the 12th, it looked a lot less like an answer and a lot more like the same question, just moved 200 miles down the coast. One final point of comparison helps put this strike in perspective, because damage and destruction get used almost interchangeably in casual conversation about this war, when, in military terms, they mean very different things for a warship. A vessel that suffers damage to its launch systems or superstructure but stays afloat can often still be towed to a repair yard and eventually returned to some level of service, provided the yard has the parts, the technicians, and the time. A vessel that's sunk or breaks apart is gone permanently, full stop, no repair possible. Based on the confirmed reporting here, none of the 4 Novorossiysk ships fall into that second category, at least not according to anything verified so far. But repair itself is not guaranteed to be fast or even fully possible, especially for a class of frigate that already depended on now unavailable Ukrainian-built components for its original construction, and for a repair facility, Novorossiysk, that multiple sources describe as lacking the same depth of maintenance infrastructure Sevastopol once had, before its own dry docks were degraded by earlier strikes. That's the practical, unglamorous reason the word irreplaceable keeps surfacing around ships like the Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov. It isn't dramatic language for its own sake. It reflects a fairly narrow and specific industrial bottleneck that analysts have been pointing to since long before this particular attack. So here's what's genuinely worth thinking about. If a fleet with a shrinking industrial base behind it keeps losing, or keeps having damaged, the various ships it can least afford to lose, at what point does the location stop mattering at all? Because there's simply nowhere left in the Black Sea that functions as a safe harbor? And if that's true for Russia's Navy, what does it suggest about the broader trajectory of a war that's now well into its 4th year? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, whether you see this as a turning point or just one more headline in a very long war of attrition. That's where this one leaves off for now. Thanks for watching.